what is it about that experience I had that really moved me? And can I impart that to the audience that's in front of me now? And in a lot of ways, I guess, it is done more off stage. It's done more in the practice room. So when I get on stage, I can just kind of let go and try to get in that state of flow.
This episode contains adult language and adult humor. Since when have trumpet players ever been considered adults? If you are easily offended by these types of conversations, consider switching to the oboe. Welcome to the Trumpet Gurus Hang podcast. I'm your host, Jose Johnson. My guest for this episode is Rex Richardson. Rex, well, he's all about the big picture. Rex uses his virtuoso-level classical technique to take his jazz playing to heights few can reach, and he brings the freedom of his spontaneous and expressive improvisational skills to the sometimes predictable world of classical trumpet playing. Rex is a committed educator, and he's never lost sight of the impact that music can make on the lives of others. So, pour yourself a big glass, pull up a chair, and let the hang begin. Hi, and welcome to a new exciting episode of the Trumpet Gurus Hang, and I am joined by the one and only Rex Richardson. Rex, how are you, my friend?
Great, glad to be with you.
Oh man, the pleasure is all mine. We were struggling, so the behind-the-scenes action for you here on the podcast. We had so much trouble just getting this link set up. I don't know what the hell's going on. This is like a technology curse day.
Zoom.
Yeah. So anyway, it's great to be able to talk with you because, I've been a big fan of your playing for years. And, I actually, a lot of the guys that I'm friends with, have studied with you over the years and have nothing but great things to say about you.
That's a relief.
Yeah, well, there are a couple that said, well, he still owes me like $50, but.
There's always one or two, right?
Yeah, there is. It was Qualick. It was Rob Qualick. It's all his fault.
Rob.
Yeah. But anyway, man, you're one of those guys that I find really interesting. I mean, obviously, in the world of being a freelance or commercial, a freelance player. Let's use that term, freelance player. You're called upon to do so many different things. I mean, you play with the symphony. So you're with Richmond Symphony, correct?
I'm not a member of the symphony. I've just played as a soloist a couple times.
Okay.
And I've had the chance to sub with them a lot. The last few years before COVID, the travel was getting busy enough that I was having bad luck. Every time they called, I pretty much wasn't able to do it. But before that, I would get to come in and play third or second trumpet pretty often, And in fact, I do have my next solo appearance with them in April, doing a couple new concertos and a bunch of jazz arrangements. So that's be fun. But
nice. Yeah. So you do that. You get your brass band of Battle Creek shirt on, doing your swag there. So I mean, you're doing the classical repertoire, the solo repertoire. You're doing jazz. You play it all, and you play it all at an extremely high level. And that's one of the things that really fascinates me is how people can not only do that at a high level, but be able to switch gears so quickly. So, has your brain always been wired that way? Have you always been kind of, this diverse kind of person?
I don't know. First of all, I want to say I think you're giving me too much credit, really, in terms of what I'm able to do. I find that over the years has been kind of an evolution, something that I see, I guess, wasn't all that common in my generation, but kids now, it's very common where they're in school, and especially if they're in a city, they got out to play every kind of gig. So, like we had a kid graduate, Hamid Barbaji, almost a couple years ago, who kind of epitomizes that idea now, where he was a sub with the Richmond Symphony by the time he was a sophomore. He was touring with a blues band around the same time. He graduated like one of the best jazz improvisers in the studio and one of the very best classical players ever to come out of the studio. So for me, my early playing experiences were along those lines. You know, I went to Northwestern, but I didn't get a music degree. I got a degree in anthropology, which meant I was kind of free to explore. The downside is I wasn't getting any trumpet lessons after the age of 19. But the good side was I was out exploring. I started to learn how to play jazz by going to jam sessions and getting my butt kicked by these better musicians and older musicians. And you know, while I was in Chicago, I got to try so many different styles of music, from like klezmer bands to Latin bands, the big bands, of course, and started really digging into jazz improvisation. And around that time, I got to play with Civic Orchestra of Chicago when I was a sophomore. But around that time, I realized that I might be better at something other than being an orchestral trumpet player. At that point, that was kind of what up to that point, that was sort of what I envisioned. And so I started looking at digging more deeply into jazz, and starting to pursue the classical repertoire that I was more engaged with in high school, because I was playing a lot of the more advanced rep back then, and then kind of in some ways left it behind to do orchestral stuff. But as the years went on, things kind of narrowed for me, you know. So I got to play with a group called Rhythm of Brass, which is a chamber brass group that plays some different styles, and I started touring with them in '95. And I stopped playing lead trumpet. I felt like I didn't really like what it did to my sound when I played. It doesn't happen to everyone, but for me it seemed to be a problem. And I ended up eventually really kind of having what I feel like is a fairly narrow focus overall, in that I do the classical solo rep, but really kind of specialize in the newer rep, a lot of which integrates some jazz elements or improvisation elements. And then on the jazz side, it's much more about, you know, kind of modernist stuff coming out of, like, a lot of musicians who are influenced by all the great stuff that came out of the late 50s and the 60s from Train and Joe Henderson and everyone else. And these days, you know, someone like Chris Potter and what those people in those circles are doing. So, for example, if you have a Dixieland gig, I'm not necessarily the guy to call for that. You know, I did have that experience in Chicago. That's when I learned I wasn't the guy to call, because I didn't know the tunes. So anyway, sorry for the long answer, but I wanted to point out that I feel like my experience has been, in a lot of ways, maybe not typical, but more typical in with the younger generation, where you get out there and you just try to play everything you can, and you hopefully gather a lot of skill doing that. And then eventually you sort of narrow down what you're doing. I think if someone, you know, because I don't even think of myself as a freelance musician anymore. Because when I was in Chicago, I was playing every kind of gig I could, a lot of studio work. Now I get to do a studio thing here in Richmond, Virginia every now and then, but almost everything has been touring, and it's all been in that classical solo vein or jazz, sort of modern jazz thing in almost every setting that I found myself. So there are other people I can think of who really kind of epitomize a freelance trumpet player. Someone like Joey Tartell, for example, at Indiana, who sounds amazing on the classical stuff and the orchestral stuff and plays incredible lead. He's a really fine jazz improviser and is doing that kind of thing. He'll sub with all these different orchestras and everything else. And so in my case, I've kind of moved out of that zone. And when I'm home, I'm practicing or teaching, and almost all my performances on the road doing something when I'm engaged as a soloist or for a jazz concert of some sort.
Yeah, cool. Well, you know, it's interesting because, you know, when I was younger and in school, it seemed to be everything was geared towards a specialization. You know, you were either a classical player, you were a jazz player. And if you were in the jazz school, you were either, you know, working on your bebop or you're working on your lead chops. You know, if you're in the classical school, you're either working on the solo rep, or, you know, you're training to be, you know, an educator or something like that. So it was real interesting how it tended to be so compartmentalized. And now it seems like that you know, because there were a few players who were out there that could just do it all, and it seems now that's kind of that as that generation of people who could do it all started teaching, then they started going, you know, hey, really, you know, dude, you need to be more well-rounded if you want to make a living playing trumpet. So so for you as an educator, you know, everybody tends to come in with we tend to have tunnel vision a lot of times with stuff. It's like we have, and that's okay, to have a clarity of vision. But, how do you impress on someone that, it's like, oh, I just want to be, I want to be a great league player. How do you impress on them the need to develop all these other tools in their toolbox that they want to be a successful working musician?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think the first thing I can draw upon is just really point out examples in the music business. The one thing that's changed beyond the fact that people are branching out is the fact that composers have branched out. You don't have people necessarily trying to avoid jazz influence in the writing. You've got orchestral players who are willingly pulling in jazz music or pop or rock or other vernacular forms of music, which I think is awesome. It's like that's all, it enriches everything. And so someone who decided they were going to be the uber orchestral player, and they get that gig and they're like, oh man, I didn't sign up for this, then, well, maybe they get to keep their job, but they're still not able to do it in some ways, and it's beyond that. And it's the same thing what you've seen the evolution in like classical trumpet players in a world where like, I mean, obviously Wynton set a standard back in the early 80s for someone who was an incredible trumpet player and was deep into the classical rep as well as an extraordinary improviser. But you see Son Jones is the same way. He's not necessarily known as playing classical music, but that's his foundation. He can show up on a brass quintet job, an orchestral job, and kill it, in addition to his extraordinary skills as a jazz musician. So I think that's, as on the jazz side, you've seen more and more musicians gaining that broader background because it helps them as instrumentalists, and they know it helps them as musicians too. When young musicians start hearing how deep into classical music, like Wayne Shorter was, and Woody Shaw, and even going back to Duke, of course. I mean, maybe America's greatest composer, right? And he developed that skill set by taking in an extraordinary number of influences, and so I think the trend has been kind of simmering there for a long time, and now it's just kind of it's just a little more explicit now in terms of musical circles and brass player and trumpet circles specifically.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's cool. I mean, it's the whole thing. Music is music, and playing trumpet is playing trumpet. And I think as I've gotten older, I certainly was when I was younger. I was very much in that kind of tunnel vision sort of thing, and as I've gotten older, I just love playing. I may not be the guy. I definitely am not the guy for the symphonic job. I can tell you that right now. But if I've had an opportunity to play with the local symphony a couple of times, and it was fun. I really enjoyed it, and because I'm playing my trumpet, man. What's there to hate about that?
Yeah, exactly. And there are different things we can do that place different demands upon us too. You know what I mean? It's like it's funny, one of the silver linings of COVID is I finally, for the first time in really maybe 20 years, was getting back to the kind of practice routine I needed to do. And so I've been shedding so heavily on the jazz side to develop the language that I want to have, both as a player and as a composer, and that's a deep dive. Same thing with some of the repertoire that I want to play as a soloist. I mean, it takes hundreds of hours for me to learn that stuff, but not all of it is that kind of thing, just like having good fundamentals and being a good musician can set you up, to play in a lot of orchestral settings, to play with a brass quintet, to play, in a jazz group that's playing standards, for example. And so you're right, a lot of it can be like, hey, you've done the work on the instrument, and you've got a reasonable exposure to these different genres, and that sets you up to go out and play in a lot of different settings and really enjoy yourself and make some money too. So that doesn't hurt, Yeah. And so there are really different angles on the business that we can dig into, and which again is why I don't necessarily describe myself as a freelancer anymore, because I'm at a point now that I think most of the time, if someone's like, hey, they want a good trumpet player, I don't necessarily get that call. I'm going to get called more if it's like, well, we know what Rex does. We want that specific thing in terms of how he deals with repertoire or improvisation or something along those lines. But it starts for all of us with the first part. You want to get to the point that you're playing well enough that when someone needs a good player to play an orchestra, play lead or whatever, you're on the list. That gives you a chance, of course, to develop your skills and develop a reputation for someone, who plays well and is reliable, hopefully, and is easy to work with. And then some people want to stay in that groove. Like there's some folks who are just these uber freelancers, like in New York City. You've had, think of someone like Ray Mace, who's like, God, one of the baddest trumpet players and most extraordinary artists on the trumpet ever. But he's basically been a freelance trumpet player, between ABQ, American Brass Quintet, not really a full-time job, and playing with the New York City Ballet and doing everything else. That's a certain kind of zone that people can find a lot of fulfillment in, and other people are going to eventually kind of narrow it down, which is what I feel like I've done. But I think, to your point, it's really important for young players, especially to get as much exposure to different genres and types of playing as possible, because all of that ends up feeding your musicianship. It all sets you up to become what you're going to be down the road. So everything I feel like I've played in some way helps me do what I'm trying to do now, even though it's probably more now than it would have been in the past.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that's kind of a cool way of looking at things, because, music and life are kind of the same thing. We kind of go through these points where we're either like very, very broad and we don't know what we want, or we're very, very uber focused and we know specifically what we want. But it doesn't tend to stay that way. It's kind of like as you look at life, it kind of starts out here and then it goes into here and then it expands out, and it's kind of more like an undulation than it is a specific straight line kind of path. And when you start to get a better feeling, and a lot of this comes with maturity, it's the understanding, well these are my strong suits, these are my passions, and these are the things that I'm going to focus most of my energy on, because these are things that have, for lack of a better word, the best payoff for you, whether that's financially or just in your intrinsic enjoyment. And it doesn't mean that you can't do other things. It just means that that's not where you put your time and energy. So, I think that's super cool, and how that all ends up coming together. And speaking of which, I saw that you had you were doing a series of lectures about jazz improvisation and what jazz improvisation can teach us about learning, mastery, and innovation. And I found that topic to be, that's like right up my alley. It's like, how do you take this one thing and how do you apply it to all things? So can you maybe talk about that a little bit? I mean, that's just a fascinating topic to me.
Yeah, it was, it ended up being one lecture. I think it was relatively short, actually, maybe about an hour long. But yeah, I was drawing upon, my own experiences as a musician and someone who studied and performed improvisation, and then also upon what I've learned from certain books. So, in fact, one of them's right here. This is one that I don't think is as well known, maybe it should be. And you can see it's a big tome, but it's Thinking in Jazz: The Infinite Art of Improvisation by one of the professors I did get to take a course with when he was at Northwestern, Paul Berliner, who's an ethnomusicologist. And it's an incredible deep dive into what it is musicians do. And I read it back in the 90s, and I've started reading it again to say, well, I'll have a very different perspective on it now as someone who's, nearly 30 years later, has been playing jazz for so long, and we'll have a different take on many things. I've also drawn upon the work of Anders Ericsson, who wrote a book called, Anders, that book, Peak, Secrets from the Science of Expertise. Amazing book, and it was a real mind-blowing experience to kind of be exposed to his insights. Another very well-known book is The Talent Code by Daniel Coyle, that I think a lot of people are making use of. And so I primarily drew upon those books as a means of making sense of how jazz improvisation works and what it can show us about, how we deal with such ideas as learning and achieving mastery and even creating something new outside of jazz improvisation. So I think one thing all of us probably realized pretty early on is like, hey, we can be exposed to different art forms and draw parallels. I was pretty young when I went to, I can't remember if it was a ballet or modern dance show that I went in Chicago, and I realized, wow, I can really learn about rhythm by watching these shows. This is a different take on what rhythm is. And of course, you can learn about rhythm from a painting, because rhythm is really about patterns, and it shows up in all these different media, and if we're kind of paying attention, we can draw lessons from that. And so some of the things I think one of the most important lessons I drew from the books and from my own experiences was the importance of broad exposure to influences. So it ties in again with some of your earlier question. I think jazz has been really incredible as an art form in the sense of what it's willing and able to absorb, and I think that's due to the nature of improvisation and the nature of the process, which is so much about, it's about discipline and exploration. It's also about making mistakes and seeing where they lead you, right? And in a way that we don't necessarily think of classical study that way. We probably should, but we end up unfortunately getting the blinders on and be like, I'm trying to play this piece and not make any mistakes. And I'm like, I've talked to students about this, like, is that what you want people to hear when you go on stage? Someone who didn't make any mistakes? They're like, no. I'm like, yeah, you don't want people thinking about that. It's like you really, what is your job is to go out and share this music with people. And yeah, of course, no one wants to have a huge number of mistakes. That's going to, draw from take away from the musical experience. But it's also about not trying to play perfectly, of course. And I think jazz as an art form, the way it's evolved, has been has lent itself to the degree of innovation that it has because of that degree of openness. One of the little anecdotes from this book by Paul Bologna that I shared in the lecture was even a little quote by Miles Davis when he was talking about Tony Williams and how inventive Tony was with rhythms and how receptive he was of things. And he said how, if Tony were walking along and he kind of tripped and almost fell over, he might think about that rhythm and play it later when he got on the drums, And also, learning about what jazz musicians in New York were doing in the 40s and 50s, that some of them they'd go out to some part of the city where it was so noisy that their noise on the street wasn't going to bother them when they're practicing, but they're trying to work in the sounds of traffic into the rhythms and patterns, and that's something that not every art form is capable of doing. And I think there are a few things there. One is just that spirit of improvisation being at the heart of the art form. And the other is just the way it evolved as a hybrid art form with so many influences. It's obviously jazz was born out of something terrible. Really, if the institution of slavery hadn't been in this country, who knows if jazz would have been born, if it would have developed the same way. And it's, to me, that kind of gives it a sort of a weight. There's sort of a depth to the art form. There's a pathos at its root. There's a tragic element to it that is also, but it also is life affirming. You know what I mean? When you see something beautiful coming out on the other side, and seeing how it's one of the most eclectic art forms out there. With the early influences being from West Africa, as well as European classical music and American marching band music, and these brilliant musicians who invented it probably without even really thinking about what they were doing. They were just playing what they heard and what they knew, and this incredible art form developed. So it's really an amazing story, and I think the lessons come from I think that kind of analysis, like realizing, well, how did this music evolve? How does eclecticism help us to innovate? And how does openness allow us to innovate as well? As we know, there's been obviously in some circles, there have been some, there are snobs for any art form, I suppose, including jazz. There's some people who are the purists. If it's not a walking bass line or it's not bebop, then it's not good. But I think that's really a minority, and especially with a lot of the musicians who have been making a big wave in the art form in recent decades have been very, very open to. I just saw Josh Redman perform with his trio at the Purdue Jazz Festival, and I was playing there with the bands the next night, and it was amazing. It's just with his trio, and he the kinds of genres they covered just in that one set were unbelievable, including playing a theme from Beethoven, from the Seventh Symphony, and just seeing where it went. And so to me, that's kind of more the spirit of the root of jazz. Speaking of Miles Davis, who exemplifies that more than him, right? If you look at his career, and he took a lot of criticism for that, but I think that was just his kind of a searching spirit that really drove his whole life. That I think is at the root of the jazz ethos, I guess you could say.
Yeah. Well, and it's the, like you're saying, the spirit of jazz. It's already a hybrid art form, and it's about taking influences. It's about bringing them together and adding this layer of emotional intensity, whether it be the joy or the sorrow, because they're just flip sides of the same coin. The great joy is because of the deep sorrow that we have. So as we look at jazz and the development of that as an art form, this is something I've talked about. Like I used to talk to my martial arts students about a lot, was that there's the development of that art form was based on absorbing, Bruce Lee said, absorb what is useful. He wasn't the first person that said that. He just had a better PR agent. But it was, it's like you find something that works, you take it, you add it to what you have, you strip away what doesn't work for you, and then then the next person does the same thing. And it should be a developmental art. It should never be the same. You're not looking to duplicate, you're looking to create. And I think that jazz is that same way, where that, as we have more resources, we have different styles of music, we have different influences that we can draw from. Then we add those to our personal life experiences, and then we can create something that is unique and, worth, listening to, hopefully. So, I think that when we get to like, well, we can't bring that in because that's not, we can't bring in hip hop because that's not music. We can't bring in classical because that's, So I think that sometimes when we do that, when we become so, when we fail to be inclusive, we fail to make the music what it can really be.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the talk about, the phrase inclusivity. I mean, nothing, jazz is more inclusive than anything, really. I think in terms of the people who are involved and love it around the entire globe of every conceivable background, and the genres of music that it's proven itself open to. You think of stories like, I've watched some interviews, like Michael Brecker is one of my biggest heroes, and I love Randy too, who's amazing and a super gentleman. But I've always had just this, a little bit of an obsession with Mike Brecker's playing. I probably copied more from him than I have from trumpet players, maybe. But so I watched interviews of him, and he talks about who he's listening to when he was a kid, and it was all kinds of rock and pop music, and you saw, what came out of the Brecker brothers. And so these are guys who were able to deal with genres at many different levels, and yet when they were playing jazz, they could also do that at the absolute highest level of the art form. And to me, that's the best goal right now in terms of what the art form can be. It's like you need that breadth, and also you need that the depth of achievement to really make it worthwhile.
Yeah. Well, and I've had this conversation recently with a few guests. A couple episodes ago, Brad Good in particular was really talking about how jazz is basically an oral tradition. That's how everything was passed down, and that we've kind of I understand the reasoning. We've institutionalized things. We've tried to make it a science. Of this is how you do it, and these are this is what you should play over a minor 2/5, and this is what you should do over So we teach these little mechanisms to help us to ideally become better players, but sometimes people get so engrossed and engaged in the theory of it as opposed to the actual execution, which is supposed to be this expression, this unique expression. And people play it safe. They want to play the right notes. They want to do things. But like for me, I mean, my favorite improvisers in terms of trumpet, my three favorite ones are Miles, Woody, and Freddie. And all of them, and you listen to any of their recordings, I don't care whether it's a studio recording or live recording, you hear a lot of little chips here and there, and you hear things that, and because they're always pushing their limits a little bit.
Yeah.
They're never playing it safe. And that to me is, that's really what touches my heart. It's great to hear somebody play a perfect line, but if you cuff a note or two, but you've got some stank on that, it's like, yeah, that's what I want to hear.
It's funny, man. It makes me think. I've said this a few times when, talking about, missing a note or something. I was like, man, you guys I was talking to some kid. I said, did you ever notice how I was missing Freddie and Miles in particular, actually, how both those guys could just miss a note. It would be the baddest thing you ever heard. It was just what would be in that miss would be so killing. I said, that's very instructive for us. You know what I mean? It's like, now they're not trying to screw up or something, but it's like they're doing what you're saying. It's like they're at the edge of their ability. And it's the kind of thing where, really we want that same balance of performance in classical performance. Like probably, I've got so many, I got dozens and dozens of trumpet heroes, and it's expanding all the time, because I keep discovering new players or younger players that are coming up. But probably my favorite classical soloist of all time is Håkan Hardenberger, who has been kind of dominating the scene really kind of since the 80s as far as the serious classical soloist. But the thing I really love about Håkan's playing is that he always goes for it. I mean, that guy misses sometimes. He'll just kind of wipe out on something. It's not often because he's got such incredible command of the music, but he's not playing it safe. And so every note has this sense of commit. So as soon as he starts playing, you're like, whoa, man, this is a kind of film, it's a movie or a story, whatever. I'm being pulled in here. And I think that's what it requires is you have to, on the one hand, yeah, you're building your technique, you're building your facility, and you're learning to play correctly, whatever. But on the other hand, you're also training yourself to let go and just tell the story with a sense of reckless abandon, or something close to that at least, that we find that great balance between there's great command here, and there's also the beauty of watching someone operate at the edge of their abilities, the beauty and excitement of that. Seeing someone who's a master like those guys, whether it's Miles or Freddie or Woody or Håkan, operate at the edge of what they can do. What can be more thrilling than that, right? It's amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's I'm a firm believer. It's one of my favorite quotes: "How you do anything is how you do everything," and it's just there's a way, and in terms of like we're talking about with Anders Ericsson, the concept of the dedicated practice, and all that stuff. Yeah, that's how you get good at anything. Now. However, there are always going to be, the little specifics, the nuances of it. But, like when you talk about getting like, especially for athletes, talk about being like in the zone, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, I can never pronounce his last name, wrote a book called Flow. And it's about, the state of, high performance. where things are just happening. But one of the keys to flow is you have to be at a stage just slightly beyond what you're capable of. You can't be too far, trying to be doing too much. You're not doing 200%, but you just have to be right at that sweet spot where you're just going past what you normally are capable of doing.
Totally, it's really just over the edge, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's what allows us to, because it keeps us fully engaged, but not going into a freak out zone. You know what I mean? It's like right in that sweet spot, as you put it. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. and it's so hard because it's like societally we've allowed ourselves to be beaten down and have these preconceptions, the perfection, and you can't chip a note, you can't do this, you can't do that, and and not. It seems like we don't encourage people to take chances. We're always cautioning them not to fail. And by doing that, the way the brain works anyway, if you say don't fail, you're just basically setting them up to fail.
Yeah, it's true. It's funny, man. I think in musician circles, a lot of that, you could argue a lot of it has come in recent decades from the work of rather lazy orchestral audition committees, People, they're like in their first round and, maybe some of the people really care and others, they're just looking for someone who doesn't chip a note and they get passed on. And when that happens, lots of times the very best musician in the room might get thrown out in the first round. Someone that they would really love to have in their section who's going to, play consistently, but more than that, who's going to bring all this musicianship into the ensemble. They might get thrown out because they weren't 100% technically perfect. And someone who's training themselves for that, who ends up being a bit robotic in their playing, maybe even ends up passing on to the final rounds. And it's a really unfortunate process, because I think that when you see someone who plays like that making it to the final round, then those lessons get passed down. It's like, oh, you got to play like this. Just keep it in the box, keep it safe. Nice, pretty sound, but don't do too much with it. Make sure your time is correct rather than expressive, and on it goes. You know what I mean? Then we have that kind of a tradition evolving in music instead of one that's more likely to foster creativity, unfortunately.
Yeah, well, and that's so spot on, I think, and it's the to our detriment. It's that striving for perfection, which is it's an illusion anyway. That it's never going to be perfect, But I think one of the things that especially when I was younger, and now I have, like I said, was saying earlier, having more of a global perspective, maybe my way of looking has changed. But I think a lot of people still have this thing about, well, classical music, the emphasis is on technical accuracy, and then jazz, it's the creative, the improvising, the freedom, but not seeing how those two work together. That, if you have technical accuracy, but you don't have any feel, it doesn't matter whether you're playing, bebop or whether you're playing the Brandenburg. If you're just playing the notes on the page, then it's really not music. It's not an art. And if you've got great ideas, but you don't have the facility to be able to express those ideas, then you're really not doing anything to push your art forward. So it's finding that balance. So like for you, I mean, I'm sure that you've gone through those phases. You already kind of talked about how you were doing the hard practice. How do you work with creating that fine balance of, taking care of the technique and making sure that you don't allow the technique to get in the way of your intentions?
Yeah, that's such a great question. And a lot of it comes down to, there's the development of fundamentals, that we all work on. And then there's learning how to practice performing, on the other hand. Because if all I'm doing in the practice room is trying to, work up these licks or these passages so that I'm trying to get them perfectly executed at a certain tempo, And that's as far as it goes. And then I get on stage, well, I might be just trying to do that instead of remembering, hey, this, music is really about a sense of narrative. More simply put, it's, it's like listening to a story, or, the same things that characterize a great piece of music or a great improvised solo are the same things that characterize even a great television episode. You know what I mean? Or novel. It doesn't matter on the scale. There's some kind of conflict and development is introduced, and then there's a resolution of it. And that's the simplest terms. Of course, you can analyze even those little sections down to very fine constituent parts, I think. But they all, everything we experience as art, in particular in our Western tradition, is characterized by that kind of a structure. And so I have to remind myself that what I'm trying to really impart to an audience is that story. And the way I try to achieve that is I really draw upon the memories I've had of being in the concert hall and having an amazing experience. Like hearing some of my favorite artists, trumpet players or otherwise, violinists, pianists, just ensembles, and remembering like what it was that made me really feel like I was having an experience and I was really uplifted. And because I figure it's my job to do that for an audience member too, right? And so if I can project, if I'm on stage projecting, this is what I'm hoping is the experience on the other side. And not every piece will necessarily allow you to do that. Sometimes you're going to be less conscious about what you're doing than that. You know what I mean? But to me, there's always kind of an element to that of like, what is it about that experience I had that really moved me? And can I impart that to the audience that's in front of me now? And in a lot of ways, I guess, it is done more off stage. It's done more in the practice room. So when I get on stage, I can just kind of let go and try to get in that state of flow. But I guess if that's hopefully answering the question, that's the balance where it's like I do practice to play things technically perfectly and technically as fast and as high and as loud or soft as I can do them. But that's for the practice room. When I get on stage, just to be like, okay, you've done the work, now just let it go, just put it out there. And I don't expect myself to play perfectly anymore. I did when I was younger, and I was always angry because I never did. Now I know I'm going to miss something, but I also, you run into this with kids a lot too, where they're probably less so now in the days of YouTube, but when I was growing up, we had all these commercially produced recordings and everything's edited, everything's, polished. And I didn't know that my favorite trumpet players missed notes on occasion, and I'm at a stage now where I've heard every single one of my favorite trumpet players miss notes in performance. And it's like, well, they're still my favorite players, that did nothing to diminish my enjoyment of who they are as musicians. And I figure, who am I to have higher standards than that? It doesn't make any sense at all. So I don't expect, I practice for perfection in a certain sense, but I don't expect that on stage. I just want to share the music. And then if I can do that successfully, I'm less in my own head. It's less about self-awareness or ego or other things that I might be worried about. And it's just like, hey, we're all just getting to enjoy this music together. Isn't that awesome? What a privilege for me to be on stage sharing this music with people. And then that also helps me to feel more relaxed on stage. I have a better time, and probably the audience has a better time as well because I'm having a good time. So anyway, that's how I think of the balance, is sort of balancing those different considerations of technical expertise that I'm developing in the practice room, and also training myself to forget about that, as Bird said, learn your horn and then basically forget about it and play, to paraphrase. But it's like, it's that same concept that I think we all need to draw upon in one way or another to have our best experiences on stage and to give our audiences the best experiences as well when they're listening to us.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. And one of the things that you said that really kind of resonated with me was, thinking about the feelings that you had experiencing being in an audience, and then trying to take those and to share that same feeling with someone else. And I think that that's such a cool way of thinking about it, because we do get in our own heads way too much, and that's, I think that is ultimately the distinction between like average, good, and great, is your ability. It's not so much it's not so much that you're not making mistakes. It's how you deal with the mistakes that you make. Because, you look at that, like if we use an athlete, for example, you look at an average quarterback, and they throw an incompletion, or they throw, on a big play, or they throw a pick, they're going to get in their head and they're going to start second guessing themselves, and they're going to start being afraid to throw the ball. A good quarterback is going to, deal with that a little bit better, but a great quarterback, they don't change your game plan. They, you look at a Tom Brady, as much as I hate him, you look at a Tom Brady, or you look at, an Aaron Rodgers or somebody like that. And it's like, okay, look, hey, I blew that last play, but guess what? I'm going to eat you alive on the next 10. And it's just that go for it.
Man, I saw an incredible example of that when I was in high school, when I went to see the National Symphony in D.C., because I went to high school in the Northern Virginia area, and so often would, whenever I could, go see concerts in the city, and they were doing Mahler's Sixth Symphony. And so Steve Hendrickson was playing principal trumpet at the time. He's still around, thankfully, but when he was playing the orchestra, his playing reminded me of Hirsch a bit. It was just this very, very kind of burly, fill the room, just incredible core to the sound, very heroic kind of approach to playing, And so that there's that opening trumpet solo, the beep, boom, ba, 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 boom, beep, ba, ba. So I can't sing the pitches because I don't have the range, but it goes up to the high B on C trumpet, and it repeats, which is kind of a crazy thing. He had like this repeating exposition, like something that would have been from the 18th century. It's one of the weirder things about that amazing symphony. But the first time through, Steve, he cacked the hell out of that high B. It was like a Freddie or Miles cack, man. It was like, pshaw. He didn't cack it because he was holding back, I put it that way. I was like, whoa. And he was very calm. He showed nothing. And then the next one, I knew it was going to repeat. It's like, oh man, I would have been like crawling off stage by now, And instead, he played freaking stronger and absolutely nailed it. And to me, that exemplifies what you're talking about. He wasn't, dealing in some kind of grief based on what had happened, with that one note, which to me, I still think was an incredibly soulful miss, the way he missed it the way we want to miss a note because he was going for it, not because he's being careful. And then he rose up and killed it the second time because of this sense of fearlessness. And he was being fearless, and he also wasn't willing to punish himself for what had happened, which I think is very important. It's not only bravado, or it's also just realizing, man, you got to forgive yourself for what happens on stage. It was Chris Gecker who told me this early on, where I was at Aspen Music Festival. I think I was pretty young, maybe 17 or 18, and they had the festival orchestra where we get to play with the faculty sometimes. And I was playing with Chris, and I was really worried about this one moment because he had it was some contemporary piece with a trumpet solo, and it was kind of bizarrely long and taxing, and he wanted me to step in and play one of the phrases, and he was jump in. I was like, oh my God, I got to sound like Chris for this phrase. How am I going to do that? But I chipped a note when I did that, and I was so angry at myself. And Chris was like, hey man, in the rehearsals, you were a little bit loose. You were always very focused and paying attention. And then in the concert, you got really angry at yourself because you chipped something. He says, you got to flip that. He says, like when you're in rehearsal, when you're practicing, do the deep dive, be very commanding, be very demanding, be very, very focused. But when you're performing, just forgive yourself. Just let yourself make mistakes, and you'll find that you actually play better and have a better experience. And so It took me a long time to actually be able to start implementing that, but that was probably those two experiences were really important and helped me to realize those principles.
Yeah, that's a great lesson there. So this next question is going to be kind of metaphysical, if you will. Okay. All right. When people get in states like flow, the zone, whatever you want to call it, sometimes it's almost like people will say it's like almost an out of body experience where things, ideas, actions come up that they have no idea where they came from. It's just like, oh, okay, there it is, and you've kind of disengaged the conscious mind, and you're tapping into a greater, whether it be, the collective unconscious or, universal intelligence, whatever you want to call it, but you're tapping into something that is a little bit beyond you. Have you had that experience, or do you feel, is that kind of like where you feel almost disconnected from your regimen itself when you're in that state, when you're really expressing yourself as an improviser?
Yeah, I don't feel like it's necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily attribute it to anything sort of metaphysical, but it's more about, I think, realizing how heavy stuff can get with us just in the normal physical natural realm. I feel like we underestimate that sometimes, how profound our experiences can be with really as experienced entirely in our own body and cranium. You know what I mean? It's like I think that comes from our general experiences of daily life are often so mundane that when something elevates that, we feel like it's got to be from outside or not. So, and I'm totally open to the possibility of being wrong about that myself, but all of us probably just we respond to the way we perceive it, And in my case, yeah, I feel like there are times when I've just kind of lost myself in the process, and I think that's when I always play my best, because there's nothing else there driving it except sort of that there's that pure musical impulse, where the only point of focus is the music itself and what's happening with the other musicians that I'm playing with, and you kind of lose yourself. You almost forget you're there, or maybe you feel like you're just kind of sitting back and watching it happen. And yeah, it's a beautiful experience. It doesn't happen every single concert, I wish it did, but I think it tends to be the better the setting I'm playing in terms of the musicians I'm playing with, and maybe the engagement of the audience, and the better my state of mind. Those three factors usually would determine how likely it is I'm going to get to that point that it's just like nothing's really there but the music. It's beautiful, right? It's amazing what happens. I think any musician who's had a certain degree of experience has gone through that. It's just something we probably most of us wish we could trigger all the time, but I think it's a rare state. We tend to operate in the zone where we're in control, but there's a certain amount of looseness there, and it's fine. But every now and then it's just like, whoa, things just kind of pop where you just completely let go, and yet you have total command at the same time. It's an incredible sort of self-contradictory situation we find ourselves in, that is probably the epitome of a creative expression, really.
Yeah,
it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, it's finding that the term I used earlier, balance point, where you've developed the rote skills, the technical proficiencies, the habitual actions that so that you don't require conscious thought to do something, and when you can get because your conscious mind only can process like 50 bits of information a second, as opposed to what your subconscious mind can deal with. So when you get that out of the way, then all of the creativity, all of that stuff can be processed so much faster. But it requires this to be able to work without having to think like, well, how do I play that? How do I do that? You just let it happen.
Totally, absolutely.
So yeah. that's super cool stuff. That's stuff I can talk about forever. But I do want to ask you about some of the videos that you were doing during the pandemic. Some of those practice videos. There was some phenomenal stuff in there, and kind of what motivated you to start documenting that some of the madness that you were doing for your daily routines.
Oh, well, more than anything, it was, how it is, how we, all of us, we benefit ourselves from the ability to share with audiences and with other musicians and with students, young people who are maybe looking to us to learn some things. And all of a sudden, that was kind of gone, and it was funny for me. Maybe one reason why that was really present is because of what I almost got to do. Was I was supposed to play as a soloist with the Jazz Band of America at the Music for All National Festival in Indianapolis. And we had a chance to rehearse, and these kids were just extraordinary. I mean, it's literally probably the finest high school jazz band I've ever heard anywhere in the world. Extraordinary. And just great attitude. They were having a blast, and they're musically disciplined, but they were personally loose and happy. It was fantastic. And so then they sent us all home before we could perform. And even before then, the festival was sort of slowly disintegrating with everything getting canceled, and one by one, finally our concert was. But I realized part of that engagement with those kids made me realize, wow, this is something very special for me. This is something I really benefit from, being able to share with people like these kids who are exceptional because of the joy they're sharing, as well as the work they're doing as musicians, And so right off the bat, I thought, well, maybe if I start making videos, it can be a win-win. Maybe some people will benefit from this, and it'll be fun for me, and I'll still feel like I'm connecting with people. And so it was really a lot of it was sort of trying to achieve some self-preservation once I realized I wasn't going to be able to do any touring for a while. And it started pretty early on because I was inspired by some of my friends who were doing the 100 days of practice videos, people like Mary Bowden, who's a great young soloist and plays the Seraph Brass, runs Seraph Brass, and Tom Hooten of LA Philharmonic. Some of these folks are really into practicing. And so I thought, well, maybe I should do some of that too. And it ended up being a nice experience for me. And thankfully, a lot of people responded well and seemed to, draw some benefit from it. So I was really gratified to see that.
Yeah, no, that's a huge resource, and I highly recommend anybody who is looking for some new takes on ways to approach your practice to check out that series. And yeah,
I got the book coming out soon.
Awesome.
100 Days of Practice, 100 Days of Trumpet Practice. It's on Editions BIM, the Swiss publisher. They've been dealing with, between other deadlines and I think a bunch of folks it's this family business. Y'all got COVID. They were all kind of laid up, a bit here and there. And then, other complications have set them back a little bit time-wise. But we're getting back on schedule, and hopefully in the next couple of months, that book will be released in English and thereafter in some other languages. So, and that's an attempt for me to set up this idea of I realized that 100 days, okay, it was a hashtag. 100's a nice round number we use kind of by convenience, but it was also about the productive amount of time of a semester, at least in the U.S. Between the time you show up, you just take your first lesson and you're kind of taking your exams, that's typically about 100 days. So I said, well, that's kind of convenient because that's a great time unit for us to think of our working for people who are in school, So it's kind of outlining an approach to routine that is aimed at helping people figure out how to best structure their own practice. And that came out of those videos because that's when the publisher reached out to me and said, "Man, what if you did a book that was based on these ideas?" And I love that idea. So it's hopefully finally going to come to fruition soon.
Awesome. Well, I'll be looking forward to getting a copy of that one myself. So,
Cool.
you know,
Thanks.
help I can get. Um, so, well, we do have a few segments that we need to get to. These are our standard segments that we do every episode. And the first one is brought to us by Michael Barkley of Barkley Microphones. This is called Sound Off. And this is about your approach to developing sound for trumpet, and especially for someone who's doing work as a soloist and both in the classical and the jazz world. You know, you have to have you have your sound, but you also have to have, you know, you sound unique to the performance. So what are some of the concepts that you use for developing sound, and how do you teach those concepts to your students?
Yeah, awesome question. I like the way you phrase it too. The idea, you know, we want to have our own sound, but our sound also kind of belongs to a genre, whatever it is that we're playing. You know, so the way I think about it, to me, you know, the number of facets that can go into the quality of a sound. You know, the kind of energy with which we're engaging. You know, the air that we're sending into the instrument, and I think people obviously often think they want to shove the air through the instrument. It doesn't work that way, as we eventually learn. And so finding that balance between, you know, because mostly I think of just releasing the air no matter what it is I'm playing. And when these muscles kind of engage more, they're just doing it on their own. I don't ever really think about pushing. My concept is just like you just release the air, and it meets that air column that's defined by the shape of the trumpet. The sine waves go through and back, and we have a buzz, you know. And I don't understand on the physics level at all, because I don't have those kind of math chops. But I understand the basic concepts. And so for me, what's most important, though, among all the different elements that create a good sound, is resonance. And that is really trying to find the center resonant point of every note. Because we can play on the high side, we can play on the low side. And if we go right to the center, we're most likely to get that perfect balance between brilliance and richness, you know. And some players get so good at this, they can deliberately manipulate that sound to either side. Like I have a friend named Brian Strawley who deliberately plays just above the center, and it gives him this quality of brilliance to his sound. If you went too much higher, it would sound pinched. He's not doing that. It's like just in the right spot. And Joe Bergstaller, for example, kind of does the opposite. He sits just below the center, and it gives a really warm vocal quality to the sound. If you went a little further, it would get kind of dull, and of course it would sound flat. But everything's kind of playing around that center. So what I focus on primarily for students is trying to develop that using James Stapp type routine, bending notes, and trying to develop a really strong concept of the sound by listening to great players and by recording themselves and making direct comparisons. I'm like, look, man, it's going to be humiliating if you're listening to Chris Martin or Freddie Hubbard and you're recording yourself and comparing, but that's how we learn. You know, that's what you're aspiring to in terms of the quality of your sound. And then when it comes to switching genre, what I focus on is I want to change the sound really with just the front of the note. It's really all about the articulation, I think, because I want the same core resonance and sound production regardless of genre. But if I'm playing jazz or classical or even subgenres with a niche, you know, if I'm playing something contemporary, I might play with a much kind of more aggressive articulation than if I'm playing Haydn or Hummel, for example, you know. So I try to get a nice palette of approaches with articulation and apply them to the sound without changing the core resonance so much. And that seems to be, for me, the best approach.
Yeah, that's cool. I never really thought about that. So that's a slightly different way of thinking about that sound production. You know, think about the articulation. That's real cool.
Because some of it, yeah, because one of the weird things that it comes to when people are doing, you know, quote unquote crossover playing, whatever, it's like we learn, well, we're going to play classical music with, you know, this very clear sound, and then jazz players seem to be doing something else. And unfortunately, sometimes some classical players think, well, they're just playing loosely or sloppy or something. I'm like, no. The sound quality, you have to think it more of as an additive thing. Like one of the really strong elements of sound quality in a trumpet, and really all instruments that are used in jazz, is there's a big influence, of course, from West Africa. And all those traditional instruments, they tend to have something else attached that just kind of buzzes or hisses. That's part of the aesthetic of the sound. And so when you hear Lee Morgan play with that crackle in the sound, to me that's what that is. It's something that's added. It's a part of the aesthetic. It's not from not being schooled or something. That was kind of the old school way of classical pedagogy thinking. They used to look at jazz musicians that way. I don't think that's as common, but I think still sometimes young musicians don't have a real strong concept of what to do. Like, what do I just kind of not tongue when I play jazz? It's like, no. You just need to, develop a strong concept of not only how those great players sound, but why. Get a sense of what's happening, what's the story behind that approach. And when they have that, then it's easier for them to look at it as something they work towards, adding those elements to the sound and playing jazz, rather than something that feels kind of confusing and something that creates uncertainty for them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, gotcha. All right, fantastic. Next segment is brought to us by Venture Mouthpieces. Venture, where technology, design, and craftsmanship intersect. This is called Geared Up, and this is about our wonderful friend Trumpet Gear. And if you're interested in Venture Mouthpieces, use the code Trumpet Gurus 21 to get 10% off your order. But this is again, it's about gear, but a slightly different take on gear. Not so much what do you play, but why do you play it? What are the things that you're looking for your gear to provide you and to help you to be the best musician that you can be?
Yeah, well, for me, it's probably in some way what everyone's looking for. You're looking for comfort and sound production. And in a lot of ways, most of it comes down to comfort, because we're not always making the same kind of sound, but we're looking for equipment that allows us to make the sounds we're looking for in any particular setting. So I found, for me, the best balance I've been a Yamaha performing artist for a long time now, like since 1995. So I've been playing only the horns for quite some time, but I just use a large bore Xeno. It's not even one of the signature or custom horns, because that seemed to be, when I played for a number of the Yamaha designers that I trust, they thought, and I agree, that seemed to be what I sounded most comfortable on. I seemed comfortable in my own sound on that instrument. And I use, I have a Pickett brass signature mouthpiece. They call it the Rex Omni, I guess, because it can be used in different genres and settings. And this is actually the Rex Omni 2. It's a little bit different design than the first one, and it's pretty close to, it's very close, in fact, to just a Bach 1.5C. So I play everything on B flat, C, E flat, and D on that mouthpiece. And it just seems comfortable. It seems to give me what I'm looking for, that nice balance between core resonance and enough brilliance in the sound so that it's characteristic of what we're looking for with trumpet playing. And it works for me to find that balance between flexibility and accuracy too. So I don't feel like I'm restricted, and I also don't feel like I'm just lunging for notes and missing left and right, because I played bigger mouthpieces that felt like that, lots of flexibility but no accuracy, and also smaller mouthpieces where I felt accurate, but I also felt kind of constrained. So this all just is all about kind of striking the perfect balance for me.
Yeah. No, that's cool. That's cool. I really like the statement about, finding that balance between the accuracy and the flexibility, because I think sometimes, we get, whether it be with the mouthpiece or with the horn, like where the slots are just like so tight and so locked in that you don't have any wiggle room. And I had like an old, had an old Colicchio, one of the ultras, and beautiful sounding horn, great jazz horn, but the slots were so loose that playing lead on it was horrific.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, it's definitely a thing. I mean, finding that balance for what it is in particular we're trying to do, and even really mine is probably if it's one way or the other, a little more on the looseness side. So I have to practice my accuracy above the staff more than I do, say, flexibility. But I've been comfortable with that with that balance. If it was on the other side, maybe I might have to, reverse what I'm practicing, get a little more flexibility going. But the key for me, really, above all, is that I feel like even more than maybe the balance of those two elements is that I can make the sound I want to make in all registers. I've found some mouthpieces, especially smaller mouthpieces, where I just can't do that. It feels tight, and that's something that would be uncomfortable, no matter the accuracy and the flexibility. If you feel like what's coming out of the horn is not the tone color you want, So that works for me for now,
Yeah, well, that's all that matters. All right, final segment. This is brought to us by our good friends at Robinson's Remedies, rapid relief for your sore and tired chops. This is the Robinson's Remedy Rapid Fire Round. This is a series of questions that bounce all over the place, some about music, some about not music. And okay. I just need your quickest response to this series of questions. Are you ready, Rex?
I hope so, yeah.
All right, let's knock this thing out. All right, first question. Who's the biggest influence in your life that is not a trumpet player?
Probably Jan DeGattani, who was a beautiful mezzo-soprano singer who used to teach at Eastman. Incredible specialist in modern music. I wanted to explain because I figure most people probably don't know her name, but love her sound.
All right. What's your favorite book?
Wow. Usually it's whatever I'm reading at the time, which right now is Atomic Habits.
James Clear.
By James Clear, yeah. Just getting into that for the second time now.
Yeah, just finished that up last month.
Awesome.
What's the worst movie you've ever seen?
Probably, what was that thing that was very popular on Netflix? Bird Box? Is that what that?
Oh, yeah, that one with Sandra Bullock. I never watched it. Yeah, no desire.
I was totally blown away that there was any kind of buzz about it. It was literally, anyway, for me, it was like probably the worst thing in memory that I've seen.
All right. If you were not a trumpet player, what would you want to be?
I'd probably be in the wine business, either winemaking or importing or selling or production in some way.
Okay, yeah, I could see it. I'd be in the wine business too, but it'd be the consuming side.
Okay, then we'd have a good partnership.
Yeah, exactly. What's your favorite drink?
Probably, it's tough because I love beer. I like whiskeys, but I'm mostly a wine drinker, as you might have guessed. And probably of all the grapes, my favorite, if I'm just going to have a drink, is Primitivo. Which is basically, as you probably know, Zinfandel, but from the Puglia region of Italy. And it's just a special quality, and I'll be having a glass of that tonight, as a matter of fact. So.
Oh, man. I haven't had a Primitivo for about a year and a half, so maybe it's time to get another bottle.
Yeah, they're beautiful, right? Really nice.
Oh, absolutely. All right. Speaking of all that wine, you're going to have a dinner party, and you can invite any three people in the world can come to this party with you. Who would you want to have there?
Okay, wow. Living people. It'd probably be Håkan Hardenberger, I think. And if Freddie Mercury were around, it'd probably be Freddie Mercury, but he's not alive anymore. Oh, this is a tough one, man. Probably Joe Rogan, actually. That's a brain I'd like to pick. And man, I'm spacing on it. Maybe I don't know. Maybe Obama, someone like that.
All right, cool.
Someone I've always wanted to kind of have a beer with if I could, but.
Yeah. All right. You got 3 additional chairs at your dinner table, and you can invite now any 3 people from history, any 3 people that are no longer with us.
Ah, okay. Then I would say, actually, I know I have a stronger answer for the first question. It would probably be Beck Hansen, Beck, the pop star, would probably be my third, actually. Okay, I definitely put Freddie Mercury in there. And then I'd put, I think, Miles Davis, although he might be a difficult guest, I suppose. And what did I say? I got Miles, Freddie Mercury, and let's say Stravinsky, Igor Stravinsky.
All right, there we go. Lacquer, plated, or raw?
Oh, great! To me, it depends on the horn. I like. I've had a Rob Ross flugelhorn. I thought that really worked well. I took the lacquer off my Mirasura trumpet when I used to use it for everything. Then it didn't sound great in classical after that. Currently, I'm using a silver plating for my B flat and C and piccolo. So it gets a mixture of all in different settings, really.
There you go. All right. What's your favorite quote?
My favorite quote. Man, I'm trying to blank on that. Can I pass on this one?
You can call in a lifeline if you need.
All right, yeah, something comes to mind. Maybe if we can move it on the next question.
All right. Yeah. All right. What's your greatest fear?
I have sort of a phobia of heights, actually. It's sort of the only thing generally that I can think of that that I have an irrational fear of. Yeah. I never really understood where that came from. Yeah.
All right.
Nothing else. I don't mind spiders, snakes, any other things that typically scare people. Just heights, man. Yeah.
You could be granted one superpower. What would it be?
Oh. Probably super strength. Go old school with it.
Are you talking in the arms or are you talking about the chops?
All of it, So I could lift cars and I could also play, quadruple high C's probably. I don't know how
there
it
you
would
go.
work.
Whatever. All right. One aspect of trumpet playing do you think is the most overrated?
Well, of course, it's a high register. For sure, that I would think, yeah.
All right. What aspect do you think is the most underrated?
I think really is kind of be the opposite. I mean, I think there's something about lyrical low playing that can be so beautiful that I think a lot of people don't appreciate. I think a lot of students find they become uncomfortable in the low register because of focus on the other registers, and maybe that's one of the reasons why, As far as something to focus on, I think what's underrated or underworked on is, delicate attacks on the trumpet. That's the kind of thing a lot of people miss, I think, until it catches up with them on stage. So that's something I work on every day myself.
Well, there you go. Be prepared. All right. You can go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice about music. What would it be?
I would say always operate from the point of fearlessness and humility at the same time, in every single situation. Because I've tried to do that, but I've failed a lot over the years in retrospect.
Okay. And while you're back there, you're going to give your younger self one piece of advice about life.
I would say see if you can project what your future self is going to think about your current actions. Get out of the myopia, get out of what's right in front of you, and think more long-term about your choices.
All right, awesome. Final question for you, Rex Richardson. What do you want your legacy to be?
As a musician or as a person or
What do you want your legacy to be?
Okay. Well, I would like to think that people will look back at me as someone who helped to lift people up with the music making side and helped to offer good mentorship on the teaching side. I hope people will look back with positive feelings about that. I find that people are amazingly grateful generally. Often, like, certainly more than I deserve, and I'm often kind of just impressed by that. People have this impulse to show appreciation and gratitude. I want to be worthy of that. I want people to really be able to see me as someone who was a positive influence on people's lives, both as a musician and a teacher.
Okay, well, it's an awesome legacy, and like all legacies, we're building it day by day, and I know that you've been doing some tremendous work, and certainly applaud you for all that you're doing and all that you're going to continue to do, because you've got that book coming out. So make sure you keep everybody posted on that, because I know people are going to be chomping at the bit to get a hold of that one.
I will, yeah. I just posted an update recently, but I'm going to have a talk with the publisher tomorrow. We'll get some more details. I just remember my quote, actually. It ties in with the advice I would have given myself as a musician. A friend of mine, years ago, always said that the perfect musician has to be both humble and fearless. And I've found that's incredible advice, to someone who shows humility in front of their fellow musicians, to the audience, to their teachers, to the music itself, but also they're not afraid to engage with any of it and to put themselves out there and take risks. Yeah. And so that's probably that's been a quote I've tried to live up to as a musician, for sure.
All right. Well, very cool. All right. Well, if you want to keep in touch with Rex, you can always find him on social media, and to also his website. So make sure you keep tabs on what this young man is doing. He's got many great things for you. So
not so young though.
Yeah. Well, you're younger than me. You're younger than me. So
I don't know.
You're younger than me.
Okay.
Born in 1961, my friend.
Wow. Okay. You seem young, man. No, I was born in 1969, so in fact, I'll turn 53 on Sunday.
Yeah, we're just getting better. We're like a fine wine, man.
I hope so, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Try not to turn into vinegar,
You got that right. And we're going to have to definitely stay in touch with each other and share some book suggestions, because I think we like to read the same sort of stuff. So. Yeah,
I want to see that Mindfulness Secrets book you got there. That'd be a nice one to.
Well, I'll have to. I'm out of them right now. They're available on Amazon, by the way. If you want to buy them, they're on Amazon. I'll send you one.
That's your book.
That's my book. That's my book, man.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I didn't even know about that.
Yeah. So that's my jam. So.
All right. I'm gonna find that on Amazon when we finish here.
All right. Well, cool. All right. Well, thank you all very much for hanging with us today. And as always, if you want to, please like, subscribe, share. Do whatever it is that you need to do to make sure that the hang grows, because this is what it's all about, man. Two trumpet players getting together, talking a bunch of nonsense, and hopefully inspiring you in some way to be a better player and a better person. That's what it's all about, really. So, as always, folks, peace and slide grease. We out.
Thanks for hanging with us today. This podcast is all about creating deeper connections through our mutual love of music and the trumpet life. Make sure you subscribe to this podcast, and also like and share this episode with a friend. We want to see the hang grow for show. Please support our sponsors, and consider becoming a personal supporter of this podcast as well. Remember, for less than the price of a bottle of valve oil a month, you can keep this podcast moving smoothly. The Trumpet Gurus Hang is recorded at the Candy Factory, a co-working space and social club located in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Jose Johnson is the executive producer. Post-production editing is by Mitch Bowers. Our opening theme song was composed and performed by Lexi Signal, and our closing theme music comes courtesy of The Greatest Funeral Ever. Incidental music is by Ethan Swayze and Jose Johnson. Graphic design by Ann Kirby of the Sweet Corps. The Trumpet Gurus Hang podcast is produced in collaboration with the So Good Lancaster Media Group.